Thank you. Thanks for coming, everyone. I'm really excited to participate in my first Experts in Teams event, I guess. I think it's a really cool thing. So, I've got lots to tell you, so I'll get started. So, my challenge about a year ago was to transport myself into the future, 50 years, to Kirkenes, 50 years from now, and think about that north coast of Norway and how it will look and what happened there in the past 50 years, so reflecting back. And so I chose 3 themes that I know a little bit about. Didn't want to talk about something I don't know anything about. The sea, the coast, and the plastic. And I think those are 3 important themes for Kirkenes and many other places in the world, for now and for 50 years from now and beyond. So what I'm going to do, I'll start with this quote that I pulled from the Facebook event page about what we're going to be talking about, why this is an interesting area. And then I'm going to speak from the future. So a little bit of acting, I guess. So in a few decades from now, a major ice-free shipping lane is expected to open up above Russia, which will allow regular trade between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans year-round. And it could, it's already open in the summer, so it could be less than a few decades, we don't know. But with the diminishment of sea ice, this is happening, it's going to be happening more. And back in 2020, I think we were already connected to the rest of the world up in Kirkenes through tourism and the opening of this Northeast Passage. On this circumpolar map of the Arctic, we've got 2 lines in coral. This is the Northwest Passage. The Northwest Passage is expected to open up as well, or was expected to open up as well, but it's got a bit more of a sea ice problem than the Northeast Passage, which is shown in orange or yellow. But as you can see, the north coast of Norway, including Kirkenes, is well situated along this northeast trade route. And in fact, in mid to late December of 2019, the first of the Russian nuclear icebreakers did its trials, completed its trials. So this was on the horizon. So as I said already, this region was already well connected to the rest of the world in 2020. And when I say this region, I mean the north coast of Norway. And it was well connected in 3 ways: sea level rise, the impacts of sea level rise, and microplastics in the Barents Sea. And I'm going to talk about each of these issues one at a time. Sea level rise is the most complicated. So I'll start with that. So back in 2020, the largest sea level rise in Norway was expected in Sørlandet, the west coast of Norway, Lofoten, and Finnmark. But sea level rose higher than what models predicted back then. Models predicted 60 to 70 centimeters of local sea level rise for Finnmark, for the outer coast of Finnmark. But it ended up being quite a bit higher than what was predicted for 2 reasons. Firstly, scientists just didn't have a good understanding of how the big ice sheets, like the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheets, would respond to future warming. It's really complicated. There are lots of unknowns. We just didn't know how quickly that ice would melt. And for the other reason, also unpredictable, human behavior. We didn't know that humans would follow the business as usual CO2 emissions pathway, otherwise known as RCP 8.5, until about 2031, when the climate disasters were just occurring far too often to ignore anymore, and we took drastic measures to switch to renewable energy. But that was too late. 2031 was way too late, because we already had at least a half a meter of committed sea level rise in the pipeline, so to speak, from CO2 emissions 40 years earlier. So there's a big lag, there's a long lag effect. When you put carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, you have to wait some time to see how the effects of that will play out on the environment. So we put the emissions into the atmosphere, the Earth heats up, ice sheets melt in unpredictable ways, at unpredictable rates, faster than we expected, and then sea level rises. And it rises differently around the world for a lot of complicated reasons. But this CO2 emissions that we had in the pipeline and the sea level rise we expected from that itself was an underestimate because of how the ice sheets responded to this ongoing warming. The West Antarctic ice sheet in particular started sliding into the sea faster and faster as its ice shelves broke away. The ice shelves that we read about in the news, often in the 2010s and the early 2020s, we read that they were breaking away. They were the size of Manhattan or small European countries, for example. These have this enormous buttressing effect on the ice sheets, the land-based ice sheets in Antarctica. And when you lose those ice shelves, the ice sheets can flow at a faster rate into the sea and cause sea level to rise. But we didn't know how those ice sheets would respond at that time. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about two of the factors that control sea level rise around the world and make it relevant for Norway, for the north coast of Norway. So I'm going to look at, let's take the example of the Greenland ice sheet. When ice melts in Greenland, that meltwater enters the world's oceans, but it doesn't get distributed equally all over the world's oceans. So what you see here is in this map on the left. Let's imagine that enough ice melted up from the Greenland ice sheet that caused a 1 meter rise in sea level spread around the globe, or the world's oceans. Now, because of something called gravitational effects, what that means is that Norway will actually experience a fall in relative sea level of about 40 centimeters, whereas parts far away from Greenland will experience more than a meter of sea level rise. The problem, and the reason why I wanted to focus on Antarctica, is if Antarctica melts, ice melts, we get more, if it melts a meter equivalent of sea level rise, distributed around the world's oceans, what actually happens due to the gravitational effects is that northern Norway experiences 120 centimeters of relative sea level rise. So I'll just explain gravitational effects really quickly. Big masses like ice sheets on Greenland and Antarctica have more gravitational attraction than the surrounding ocean, and so they draw the surface of the ocean up higher around them. When they get smaller, the sea level falls around them because they have less gravitational attraction. And so if you have a big ice mass in Antarctica that's getting smaller, the sea level is falling around it, it's rising elsewhere in the oceans, and it's rising a lot the farther you are away. So the north coast of Norway is going to be hit a bit harder by meltwater from the Antarctic ice sheets than, say, South America. Okay? The other thing that impacts sea level rise, and we really only care about local sea level rise, we don't care about this global average, we care about what's happening on our particular coast, in our communities. So up here in Kirkenes, what I'm showing you here is a map of how quickly the land is moving up or down. And in a lot of Norway in 2020, the land was moving up a little bit, very slowly, or basically not moving at all. And so this legend here shows you, basically the cooler colors means the land is rising, and the warmer colors mean the land is sinking. And these land level changes are mostly related to something that happened 20,000 years ago, and that was the last ice age, when we had an enormous ice sheet covering all of Scandinavia and parts of Europe. It depressed the Earth's crust, okay? And when that ice melted away, the crust rebounded. But it takes a long time to rebound back to its pre-ice age condition or level. So what we see here is that this part of northern Norway, like a lot of Norway, most of Norway, it's fairly stable, maybe rising a tiny little bit, a millimeter or two per year, or something like that. But there's this warm colored series of dots here on the eastern side of Kirkenes, where the land is actually sinking. And where you have sinking land and rising sea level due to, say, Antarctica, the Antarctic ice sheets melting, then you have a bigger sea level rise problem in those areas. And I don't know why the land is sinking there, but it is. It could be that this area, this little strip of land, used to be underwater and it's been filled in with sediments, and they tend to settle. They're not stable. It's not the bedrock, which is what underlies the surface here. But so those are two complicated reasons why sea level rise is going to be different around the world, but also why it's going to be a problem in northern Norway. But what about the impacts of this sea level rise on the coastal environment? That's pretty important. So what happened with this increase in sea level rise? Our storm surges and our waves reached farther inland because they had a higher base level or mean sea level to begin with as sea level rose and rose. Back in 2020, a 285 centimeter storm surge was recommended as a conservative planning level for Kirkenes, but it really should have been higher. This storm surge planning level didn't include wave height. Storm surge, I'll just back up a minute here and say, a storm surge is a temporary rise in local sea level due to things like low pressure and winds during storms. But it didn't include wave height because waves and winds during storms are also very complicated and difficult to model, especially at a very local scale. Local environmental knowledge, people who have lived in Kirkenes for a long time, perhaps fishermen, people who work on the coast, who have this local environmental knowledge, their input might have helped, but they weren't consulted. Coastal communities like this experienced something called coastal squeeze, erosion where the shoreline was underlain by soft sediments, loose sediments, flooding where it wasn't, because they had nowhere else to go. This community is built between less than a meter to no more than a few meters above sea level. Things we could have done to maybe mitigate the impacts of sea level rise were to look to the past. But in the late 2010s and 2020s, the big funding bodies like from Europe and elsewhere weren't interested in funding paleo research or research that looked to the past, reconstructed past environments. They wanted to fund models. What's going to happen? We want to know what's going to happen in the future and how we can deal with that. But if we had looked to the past, these things have happened. Some of these things like sea level rise and the impacts that sea level rise has on the coastline in northern Norway have been done. People have done this. So what I'm showing you on this slide is a sea level curve and some raised beaches from northern Norway. So the sea level curve on the y-axis, we've got elevation in meters above mean sea level in 2020. That's here. Now, because of those great ice sheets 20,000 years ago depressing the crust, when they melted away around 10, 11,000 years before present, relative sea level was a lot higher. Local sea level was 24 or more meters above levels in 2020. That sea level fell rapidly, but here in this red circled area, between 9 and 7,000 years ago, the north coast of Norway experienced a rise in sea level, like what we are experiencing now in 2050. And we can look at these raised beaches and these other geological records of past sea level rise to see how the coasts respond. Because erosion happens, that means more sediments into your coastal waters. It means more heavy metals, whatever is in the terrestrial environment, things like mercury, for example. This impacts ecosystems. We've got lots of geological archives up here that could have been looked at. to help us better predict and understand how our coasts would respond to the sea level rise that we experienced in the past 50 years. So now I'm going to move to the last topic, microplastic, which is, if you don't know, any type of plastic less than about 5 millimeters long. Although we get into nanoplastics when we go really small, smaller than something like 45 microns. It takes hundreds of thousands of years to degrade. Back in 2020, we were really just at the tip of the iceberg when it came to microplastics. There was an explosion of research at that time into microplastics, especially in the marine environment, but there were so many unknowns, we had no idea how it would impact marine mammals and fish and algae and seabirds and so on. We had no idea where it was or how it behaved in marine environments. We did know in Norway there were two hotspots for microplastics in these blåskjell or blue mussels. Blue mussels they're filter feeders, so they sit upright in the sediment or on the seabed, and they suck water from the water column above them, and they eat whatever's in that. So there's all kinds of yummy organic matter for them, but there's also microplastics. And they accumulate these microplastics in their soft tissues. And a study was done in the late 2010s that showed these two hotspots in Norway for microplastics in mussels. One was not super surprising in Oslofjord, and a lot of those microplastics were found to come from tires and roads, runoff from roads. But the other hotspot was up in Varangerfjord, in Varangerhalvøya National Park, which is a little strange because it's not exactly, or back in 2020, it wasn't exactly a hotspot for people. So there were questions about where this microplastic was coming from. We had models at the time, in 2020, about the transportation of microplastics around the world's oceans. So on this model here, we're showing the Earth. The blue blobs are the point sources for microplastics entering the world's oceans. So these are the big rivers of the world where a lot of the microplastics enter the ocean. And this model was run for 50 years, and the red areas with the black outline show where the microplastics that come from these blue areas end up after 50 years, so today. And these are the big so-called garbage patches or gyres in the world's oceans. And there were 5 of them that have been confirmed in 2020. And the 6th gyre is up in the Barents Sea, just off the coast of northern Norway. Not confirmed, just modeled in 2020. And this is how it looked after 100 years running this model. The same 6 garbage patches. And of course, that was a good explanation for why these mussels up on the north coast of Norway, in an area with small populations, were full of microplastics. This is just another example of a model that shows you how the microplastics get stuck in these gyres or these garbage patches. This is our thermohaline circulation belt, or this part is the Gulf Current, which transports microplastics from all over the world up into the Barents Sea, and they get stuck there. The dots indicate plastic concentration, so the red dots mean there's a lot of plastic. We also knew from only a couple of studies that there were a lot of microplastics in sea ice. We didn't know where they were coming from necessarily, and we didn't know what happened to them when the sea ice was exported through Fram Strait and melted away. But we were starting to see back in 2020, and this increased more and more over the past 50 years, whales washing up on shore with bellies full of macroplastic in this case. But the ultimate result was that these king crab safaris and king crab fishing in northern Norway were shut down because king crabs eat blåskjell or blue mussels, among other things, and they became inedible due to their microplastic concentration and finding out that microplastics and nanoplastics aren't actually so healthy for anyone, including humans. And of course, we humans eat both. And so reflecting back from 2050, or 2070, sorry, on the past 50 years, thinking about what should we have done. First, I would have tried to facilitate partnerships between scientists and local people, citizens who have or had that long-term environmental knowledge of things like waves, wind, and storms to make better predictions about the impacts of sea level rise. Our models are pretty good. Of course, we need to know more about how ice sheets are going to behave, and I feel that it would have been impossible to predict how humans were going to behave in terms of emissions, but at least we have some knowledge that we didn't tap into, that we should have. We should have adopted adjustable engineering solutions that could be easily adapted for expected sea level and storm levels for the next 50 years. So if we're wrong in our predictions, and we were, it doesn't matter if we have an adjustable engineering solution. So for example, in port facilities or building along shorelines that are vulnerable to sea level rise. More mapping and monitoring of the microplastic offshore of the north coast of Norway and in the coastal zone would have been helpful. Partnering up with innovative researchers and students at Norwegian universities as soon as possible to find ways to stop the tide of plastic and provide incentives for testing and experimenting with new technologies and ideas here in Kirkenes. And finally, I wish we had just voted for political leaders who were smart enough and tough enough to take action on radically reducing greenhouse gases and plastic pollution before it was too late, and not punish, as voters, not punish the politicians who weren't afraid to take the long view. So that's it. Thank you.